So my own radar start picking up items going 3,000–4,000 miles an hour in this area.
But I do remember speeds in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 miles an hour.
And he said it was traveling 10,000 miles plus.
And they were going somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 14,000 miles an hour.
They covered the distance from Columbus to Detroit in something like equivalent of about 20,000 miles an hour.
And I heard a couple women there in the Air Force talking about aircraft flying in and out of the atmosphere at Mach 10 plus.
It's not an infrequent occurrence out there. They happen quite often.
There were probably 1,500 reported cases at that time.
I have over 3,000 cases now.
They estimated 100 yards from the left wing was this 100-foot disc.
And the strength of the signal was as strong as the surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier. This contact was huge.
The size of these objects around 100 meters or greater.
So it would go from 1 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles to 6, 7 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles inside of 4 or 5 seconds. You have to be moving pretty quickly.
They could rise, just go straight up. They could do that, just seemed like instantaneous.
Once they started moving, they went straight up, for a while, and then they went zap.
Then it just sort of disappeared. It dematerialized.
And left the atmosphere, just was gone. It just took off into space.
It just left at high speed.
He said, "You are never to speak of this again. As far as you're concerned, this never happened."
And you never saw this, and I don't exist, and this situation never happened.
I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy.
So I was beaten, literally hitting in the ribs and pushed, and I was resisting. And I know Sergeant Bustinza was doing the same thing.
Measures have been taken by agencies to terminate people who appear to be inconvenient or troublesome through knowing too much.
A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
I am prepared to state that I have been at locations where craft of unknown origin that did not originate on the face of this planet was there. I am prepared to state that while I was there, we saw living, dead bodies of entities that were not born on this planet.
My name is Dr. Stephen Greer. I am the director of the Disclosure Project, which is a project of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This is a project which we have been working on since 1992, and during this time we have identified over 400 military, intelligence, and corporate witnesses to special access projects within the United States and elsewhere that deal with what the public has called UFOs, extraterrestrial intelligence, and advanced energy and propulsion systems. The purpose of this executive briefing is to put together some of this witness testimony. I want to emphasize that out of the over 400 witnesses whom we have identified, that we have interviewed to date on camera approximately 100. Of those, 120 hours of videotape have been created of testimony from these witnesses. This executive summary can only contain a very small tip of the iceberg, less than 1/2% of the possible testimony which we have. But it will give you an idea of the extent of the knowledge of these men and women who have come forward heroically to tell the world, to tell our elected representatives and our scientists the truth about a subject which has been the subject of much ridicule, fantasy, and speculation for over 50 years. The technologies which are in compartmented secret programs that have been derived from studying extraterrestrial technologies as well as human innovations, which deal directly with energy generation and propulsion systems, are technologies which would enable the entire planet to begin to work in an integrated function and in a way that does not lead to greater and greater spiraling gaps between the rich and the poor. Beyond this, there is something of even greater concern. One of the witnesses whom you will hear from is a person who worked directly with Wernher von Braun, the very famous rocket scientist and space explorer, who warned on his deathbed that there were people planning to put weapons in space or to have space-effective weapon systems, which would be used in a hoax scenario from a threat, a hoax threat, that would be of extraterrestrial origin. There is no evidence that we are under any threat from any civilization from outside our solar system or within our solar system. However, there is a lot of evidence from this testimony that there are people who are deliberately trying to weaponize space under the guise of many situations which are really hoaxed scenarios. This is dangerous because if we are not alone in the universe, we cannot view space as our own private domain for Homo sapiens. We must view space as a frontier which must be shared peacefully with diverse life forms from throughout the universe. I should emphasize that this human testimony is key, and in a sense is more important than any physical evidence because it is multiple, it is corroborating, and it can not be tossed out in a cavalier fashion. We should be very careful that we do not ignore this testimony because the testimony of these men and women serves as a significant body of evidence with corroboration of photographs and other government documents.
Basically because of my counterintelligence training and police work in an outfit called Office of Special Investigations. Since I had one of the few pilot-trained investigators, I ended up doing a lot of investigations of aircraft, unusual aircraft accidents in which sabotage was suspected, and as a consequence became acquainted with some outstanding scientists and worked with the Air Technical Intelligence Center on a project called Grudge. At that time, Office of Special Investigations was a worldwide investigative unit in the Air Force and were given the responsibility of investigating what became known as unidentified flying objects. And my job was to hand carry these reports over to the technical center and coordinate them with the project officer, answer any questions from an investigative viewpoint that I could assist on. Some of the objects reported were tracked on radar. We had objects with four-way confirmation: ground visual, ground radar, airborne visual, airborne radar. And so far as I'm concerned, it don't get no better than that. I do remember speeds in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 miles an hour, which were far in excess of any known aircraft that we had or any of the enemies. There's no question, I've seen radar photographs of organized flights of unidentified objects, balls of light, if you will. And these were on radar, ground, visual, ground radar, airborne visual, airborne radar. Now the airborne visual, strangely enough, by the time they get a couple of fighters down there, those things apparently disappeared whenever they wanted to.
In spring of 1970, while I was stationed in Klamath Falls, Oregon, I came up to the radar site on the evening shift, and where there's normally 2 or 3 people in the radar room, there was quite a few, from the cooks to maintenance, all kinds of people. And I asked what was going on, and they said that they was watching a UFO, and I immediately was stunned and asked if the Pentagon was notified. Somebody called the president, and they said no, they don't do that. It was stationary, wasn't moving at all, and it would slowly lower itself down. It would until it got behind a mountain, so that you lost radar contact. It would stay down for about 15 minutes, and the next thing you knew, it was right back up there. It was up, 80, 90,000 feet. And then the next sweep of the radar scope, it would be, like 200 miles away, stationary, completely stopped. And I said, well, we should call the news media or, call somebody. This is earth-shaking news. And to me, and he said, no, just calm down. NORAD knows about it. They called NORAD. And that's when the senior NCO pulled me to the side and said that NORAD knows about it. That's the only people we notify. We don't talk about this. We don't tell anybody about this. The people that know. And we just watch, see what happens, and that's it. And I insisted, well, there has to be a report filed or something filed, And he said, well, that there is a report that you can file. It's about 1 inch thick. And the first 2 pages is about the sighting. The rest of it is basically a psychological profile of you, your family, your bloodlines, everything. So when the Air Force goes through it, they can discredit you completely by either saying that you was on drugs or your mother was a communist or anything to discredit you, and you'd never get a promotion. And I'd spend the next 3.5 years up at the North Pole, living in a tent checking the weather balloons. My second encounter was while I was stationed in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. It was in 1972. I was working alone that night when I got a phone call from the switchboard operator. He said he had the state police on the phone and wanted to talk to me. He was real frantic when he got on the phone and said that there's 3 UFOs over the north tower of the Mackinac Bridge. So I immediately, turned on the radar. When they asked if I had it on radar, I told them no. It's more of a programmed response, thinking back to Klamath Falls, where you're told you don't talk about it, you don't write it down, you don't discuss it. And in the meantime, I called NORAD and told them, and they looked it up, and they said, oh, it's coming up, they're going up I-75. I said, yes, at about 70, 80 miles an hour. Now, about halfway between St. Nicholas and Sault Ste. Marie, there's Kinchlow Air Force Base, which is a SAC base, which they have B-52 bombers. They had 2, apparently, that were on final approach, and that crosses I-75. And so apparently they diverted those 2 bombers because they didn't want, if they have nuclear weapons or not, but they didn't want to take a chance on them meeting UFOs about the same altitude crossing the highway. So they diverted the 2 B-52s. It was a real eye-opener, how deep the secrecy goes, how deep the cover-up is.
We were flying tankers over England, and London Control asked us to intercept a UFO. And we happened to be done with our refueling mission, and we accepted the assignment. We were on just over the North Sea, and they asked us to fly to the center of England. And we got about, I'm not exactly sure, 20, 30 miles out, and I got it on radar. And it was a very large return. And obviously London Control had it on their radar, and they were vectoring us to this object. And when we got about a mile from it, as a matter of fact, we were diving on the thing, and the whole aircraft was shaking. And it just took off into space at several thousand miles an hour.
At about 1:30 or so in the morning, I noticed this real bright light to the east of my field, and it was kind of a light green, I would describe it, and it had a red light underneath it, And the red light, it wasn't actually a flashing light. It's kind of, I'd say, pulsating type. Probably be a better description of it. Red underneath. And so we called it down to the air defense people at Los Angeles Air Defense Sector. And at one point in time, they had at least 4 different radar sites that were getting radar returns on these things. And then all of a sudden, there's like 3 more objects, but these 3 stayed like together. They stayed like I don't know if they were formation or what it was, but anyway, these 3 stayed together, and then they stayed there for a little bit, and then they moved down to the south of me and set there stationary a while. And then a little bit later on, there's 3 more appears, but these 3 are individual ones, and so at this point I had like 7 of them. Well, about 3 different times that night, he was able to, he'd say contact. And that contact means he had contact with something on his radar in the cockpit of the aircraft. But these objects played around there for the remainder of my ship, and they just disappeared into the atmosphere. I know it was not a helicopter. I know it was not an airplane. I know it was not a balloon, a weather balloon or any other type of balloon. And I know it was no known aircraft flying object that we know of today.
The way it started is there was a 747, a Japanese airline, 747 was coming from the northwest going across the Alaskan territory. And he was at either 31, 33, or 35,000 feet. And it was, I want to say around 11 o'clock at night, but you can check the real times. He called and asked the controller if the controller had any traffic at his altitude. And the controller said no. Basically, it was a midnight operation. They didn't have too much traffic. And he said, well, something like I have a target at my 11 o'clock or 1 o'clock position, about 8 miles. Now, in the 747, they have radar in the nose that picks up the weather outside there. So his radar is picking up a target. He sees this target with his eye, and the target, the way he described it, was a huge ball with lights running around it, and I think he said it was like 4 times as big as a 747. Well, when they read the reports that come through, the FAA has to protect themselves, so you can't say you saw a target, even though this is what he said. So they made him change his report to position symbols, which makes it sound like it wasn't really a target. The military controller has what they call height-finding radar, and they have long-range radar and short-range radar. So if they don't catch it on one of their systems, they catch it on the other. And if you listen to the military man, at one time he said, I have it on the height radar, or my range radar, whatever he called it, which indicated that he had a target on his system. The Japanese pilot would say he's now at 11 o'clock, he's now at 1 o'clock, he's now at 3 o'clock, he was bouncing around, this guy here, and when he would say that, the military guy would cut in and say he's now at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and he would confirm the position. So it would go from 1 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles, to 6, 7 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles inside of 4 or 5 seconds. You have to be moving pretty quickly. When it was all done, and we went back to Washington the next day, the administrator had called down and wanted to know if he had a problem or not. And my boss had told him, well, we took a video of it, and it looks like there might have been something there. The administrator, which was Ingen at the time, Admiral Ingen, he said, well, have you got that video with you? Can you show me the video? And I said, yeah, and you just plug it in and play it. So we plugged it in for him. He started watching it, and after about 5 minutes, he told the staff, I cancel my, he had a meeting with someone in 15 minutes. He says, first he said, I'll be late, and then next it was cancel, and then I'm going to be here till this is over. So he watched the whole thing, just over half an hour. A few minutes later, the admiral calls down and says, I set up a briefing tomorrow morning at 9 or 10 o'clock, what it was. In the round room, bring all the stuff you have, bring everybody up there, and give them whatever they want. And we want to get out of it, just let them do whatever they want to do with it. They brought in 3 people from the FBI, 3 people from the CIA, and 3 people from Reagan's scientific study team, and I don't know who the rest of the people were. But they were all excited. When they got done, they actually swore all these other guys into that this never took place. We never had this meeting, and this was never recorded. He said this is the first time they ever had 30 minutes of radar data on a UFO, and they're all itching to get their hands into the data and to find out what it is and what really goes. And if they come out and told the American public that they ran into a UFO out there, it would cause panic across the country, so therefore you can't talk about it. And they're taking all this data. So I said, okay, take all that data, if that's what you want. But they took only what we had there. They didn't ask me if there was anything else that I had. They said they're taking all this data. And I said, fine. Now I had the original video that I took, and I had the pilot's report that came through, the first report, and I had the FAA's first report that was all downstairs on my table. They didn't ask for that, so I didn't give it to them. When they asked me what I thought, I told them that it looked like we had a UFO that was up there. The reason it wasn't on the FAA's tapes was because it was too large of an aircraft, and it was picked up as weather, so we wouldn't record it. That the pilot, the Japanese pilot, seen it. The Japanese pilot drew pictures of it. Eventually, they gave the Japanese pilot a hard time because of what he said he was embarrassing his country. Our military controllers said they seen it. Our FAA controllers said they seen it. Our FAA controllers, after a period of time, came back and said they really didn't see a target. They saw something else, which makes it sound like somebody is helping them fill out their reports, and therefore that looks suspicious. My guess is, because of the way it was, it's not part of the military's operation anymore, that it was a UFO. But who do you tell that you were involved in a UFO incident without them looking at you like you ain't wrapped too tight?
This next section of the video, of this briefing tape, is regarding the Strategic Air Command and nuclear facilities. I wish to emphasize that the witnesses we have here, again, are from diverse services. They range from the Atomic Energy Commission to people who have been at Strategic Air Command facilities and at missile launch control facilities throughout the United States and Canada. These witnesses give unmistakably clear testimony about the fact that these extraterrestrial vehicles appear to be quite concerned with our weapons of mass destruction. And in fact, more than one of these witnesses has stated to me that they believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles were there because they were very concerned that we might blow ourselves up, or that we might begin to go into space and be a threat, perhaps someday, to other civilizations.
They counted down the missile. We heard engine ignition, lift off. We knew the missile was underway. And we were looking down south, southwest, and the missile popped up through the fog. It was just beautiful. And I hollered, there it is. And our guys on our M45 tracking mount with 180-inch lenses on it got it. And the big BU telescope swung over and got it. And we followed the thing, and sure enough, we could see all 3 stages of powered flight as they burned out and dropped away. And then, of course, to our naked eye, all we saw was a smoke trail going off into subspace as it headed off toward its target, which was Eniwetok Island, Eniwetok Atoll. So we whooped and shouted and heard the film wrap off in the BU telescope, and figured, well, that was our first big deal, and we got it. We sent the film back down to Vandenberg, and I don't know exactly how long it was after the event. It might have been a day or two. I was called into Major Mansman's office. at the 1st Strategic Aerospace Division headquarters. And I walked into his office, and they had a screen and a 16mm projector set up. There was a couch, and Major Mansman said, "Sit down," and there were two guys, as I recall, two guys in gray suits, civilian clothes, which was fairly unusual. And Major Mansman said, "Watch this," and turned on the film projector. And I watched the screen, and there was the launch from a day or two before at Big Sur. It was quite exciting because of the length of the telescope. As the Atlas missile entered the frame, we could see the whole third stage, which has two rocket nozzles like this and one in the center, a gimbaled one in the center, fill in our frame from about 160 miles. That was pretty exciting optics. We watched that stage burn out. We watched the second stage burn out. We watched the third stage burn out. And into the frame came something else. It flew into the frame like this, and it shot a beam of light at the warhead, which is represented by my thumb here. Now, remember, all this stuff is flying at several thousand miles an hour. So this thing fires a beam of light at the warhead, hits it, and then this thing flies up like this. Meanwhile, we're all going like this, fires another beam of light, goes around like this, we're going like this, fires another beam of light, goes down like this, fires another beam of light, and then flies out the way it came in. And the warhead tumbles out of space. The object, the points of light that we saw, the warhead and so forth, were traveling through subspace about 60 miles straight up. And they were going somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 14,000 miles an hour when this thing caught up to them, flew in, flew around them, went like this, and flew back out. Everything was going about between 11 and 14,000 miles an hour that way. Now when the lights came on, Major Mansman turned around and looked at me and said, "Were you guys screwing around up there?" And I said, "No, sir." And he said, "What was that?" And I said, "It looks to me like we got a UFO." Major Mansman, who was a very good reader of film, said that the feeling at the time was that it must have been extraterrestrial. That they assumed that the beam of light that struck the warhead, the dummy warhead, was some sort of plasma beam because it looked like a plasma beam. He said what happened is this. They took the film and they spooled off the part that had the UFO on it, and they took a pair of scissors and cut it off. They put that on a separate reel, they put it in their briefcase, they handed Major Mansman back the rest of the film and said, "Here, I don't need to remind you, Major Mansman, of the severity of a security breach. We'll consider this incident closed."
This is July of 1952. And of course, during that period of time, I made a lot of contacts. I was a staff officer for the Military Liaison Committee between the chairman of the AEC and the Secretary of Defense. And so I became acquainted with not only the Army, Navy, and Air Force, but civilian agencies, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and other contacts which I developed. During that period of time, one of my functions was to accompany a security team which visited all of the nuclear facilities to check on the security of weapons. And we were getting reports of visits by UFOs over the storage facilities and even some of the manufacturing facilities. Later, I was assigned to the San Diego Corporation as a military liaison, and I was involved in establishing a quality assurance program for the manufacture and the quality and the maintenance of the nuclear weapons. So we had to visit all of the manufacturing facilities, such as the Rocky Flats and the Pantex facility, which assembled the nuclear and non-nuclear components of the weapons. And so there again, we observed the UFOs were very much interested in the facilities that we were visiting. Almost cases where the UFOs became identified, at least on a radar or with reports, why they would try to scramble aircraft to intercept them. It was a very aggressive, you might say, response from our own government. Then I was assigned to the Unified Pacific Command under Admiral Felt during the 60s, and I was the officer in charge of the alternate command post involved in nuclear weapon operation planning. And during this period of time, I also learned of a number of incidents which happened. A couple of nuclear weapons sent into space were destroyed by the extraterrestrials. Our government sent a nuclear weapon for explosion on the moon's surface. It was tended to, as I understand it, to assess some scientific data and reaction and so forth. The idea of any explosion in space by any Earth government was not acceptable to the extraterrestrials, and that has been demonstrated over and over. And then further on, I finally retired from the Air Force and joined the Boeing Company, where I was assigned to the Minuteman program, where I was responsible for the configuration accounting of all the nuclear fleet of Minuteman 1, 2, and 3. And during that period of time, I also learned about incidents involving nuclear weapons. For example, they actually photographed the UFO following the missile as it climbed into space and shining a beam on it, which neutralized the missile. And this was recorded. It was all hushed up, and they split up the team that observed it, but of course eventually the news came out, and it was later published and confirmed it.
I was in charge of the Communications Center at 28th Air Division at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. I was, again, the top secret control officer there. I dispatched all the nuclear launch authenticator to the SAC missile crews and whatnot, so I had a very good top secret background to go on. One night, or one day I should say, I happened to see a message that came through my communications center. There again, I cannot quote the date, where it came from, where it was going to, but I do recall reading it and saying that basically that a UFO was seen near missile silo numbers, I can't recall, but it was hovering there, and it said that the crew going on duty and the crew coming off duty all saw the UFO just hovering in midair. It was a metallic circular object, and from what I understand, the missiles were all shut down. They were in the missile silos, and they were being, I don't know what SAC does as far as activating a missile is concerned, but it's basically on a standby mode, so it can be launched. But when they say it went down, it means they went dead. And something turned those missiles off, and so they could not be put in a mode of launching.
The event, the incident, I guess I call it, is happened on the morning of March 16th, 1967. As I recall, it was early in the morning, and I received a call from my topside security guard, and he said that he and some of the guards had been observing some strange lights flying around the site. It wasn't more than, well, within a few minutes, I'd say, maybe a half hour later. He calls back, and this time he's very frightened. I can tell by the tone of his voice, he's very shook up, and said, "Sir, there's a glowing red object hovering right outside the front gate." He said, "I'm looking at it right now. It's a glowing red object. I've got all the men out here with their weapons drawn." And of course, he was all shook up while he was telling me this. He was very excited. I immediately went over to my commander, who was taking a nap. We have a little cot down there in a rest period. And I was telling him about the telephone call we just received. And as I was relating this to him, our missiles started shutting down one by one. There were approximately anywhere from 6 to 8 that went down, but they went down in rapid succession, which again is an extremely rare. And in the meantime, I called upstairs to find out what the status was of this object. And the guard said, "Well, the object has left. It just left at high speed. Echo Flight is another squadron, about, I'd say, 50, 60 miles away from our location. But they had the same sort of thing happen. They had UFOs that were hovering not the launch control facility, but the actual launch facilities where the missiles are actually located. They had some maintenance and security people out there at the time, and they were observed. The UFOs were observed by these people out at those sites. Now, they lost all 10 of their weapons. So that morning, we lost anywhere from, 16 to 18 ICBMs. At the same time, UFOs were in the area and were observed by airmen. This incident was of extreme concern to SAC headquarters because they couldn't explain it. Nobody could explain what happened. There is another incident that happened just within a week of this, a week after, where there were radar reports and quite a few more witnesses.
So we all turned around, and they're sitting about, I'd say, a half a mile from the tower, and at about 3,000 feet was 3 silver UFOs, sitting in a farmhouse, 2 here, then 1 covering the center. Once they started moving, they went straight up, for a while, and then they went zap. And they was off our scope, and our scope would go out to 260 miles, and so that you calculate that, and that's pretty fast. I called headquarters, and the guy on the phone, he says, I said, okay, we got a contact. And he says, you mean SAC is running a mission against you? I said, not SAC. Not SAC. What then? I said, Cosmos. Wait a minute. He said, scramble your phone. So there's a switch you could throw that scrambles everything with mine. And I said, okay, my phone's scrambled. Yours scrambled, mine's scrambled. You taking pictures? Taking pictures. Taking radar pictures, taking radar pictures, taking real pictures. He says, okay, don't say another word. He says, I will send a courier up there. He'll get there in about 6 hours. You turn everything over to him. We are never officially ever noted for those pictures that they ever received those pictures. It was just went secret. It went black, like it never happened.
I was on mid-watch during my second med cruise, and it was about sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock, and I had a contact come on the radar scope. I knew the difference between surface search radar and air search radar. There's differences in polarity of the radio signal and things like this, and how the waves come back, all the stealth kind of stuff, active and passive electronic countermeasures. So I know the difference between a flock of geese, or wave returns, or false echoes. In fact, this was the first thing that challenged me to check it out in ECM as to whether or not the contact that I had on the scope was genuine. Because this was between 65,000 feet and above, and the strength of the signal was as strong as a surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier. This contact was huge. It was got my attention, and the attention of others that were on watch. There were 4 enlisted on watch and 2 officers at the time. And so anyway, in this particular case, it was showing up on height-finding equipment, and it was showing up on radar equipment. And then it began to move fairly slowly at first, and then very quickly. The CO came in, and he wanted to know what the heck was going on here, and they looked at it and asked what the hell was that, and it got the attention of the captain at that time, was Captain Clark, was my captain. My commander was Commander Gibson at the time. And there was only one person on watch in ECM. And before I knew, in a matter of 15 minutes, the ship was being turned and 2 Phantom IIs were being prepared for launch. The Phantom IIs went to afterburners, and they were about 100 miles or so away from this contact and turned on their conical scan radar to lock on, and it winked out. Just disappeared. After they land on the pipe 35 minutes later, and everybody's settled down, this thing winks back on again, and it's about 12 to 15 miles from the ship, hovering at about 30,000 feet. And in any event, they went out, and the lookouts couldn't see anything. Nobody could see anything. But it was there on our radar scope. It was not a false signal. And my SEAL told me, Jordan, this, what have you got in your log? This never happened. And I wasn't the only one there on watch that night. So anybody who was there at that time knows what I'm talking about and knows that it's the truth. But less than a dozen people knew what went on that night, and that ship had 5,000 men on it. There were documents that I have seen that refer to the Roosevelt having several instances of UFO flyovers, and particularly after they took on board nuclear weapons. And I was on board when they did take those on for the first time.
I was granted, after a 6-month wait, a top secret special compartmented intelligence clearance with a zebra stripe identification badge, which permitted access to all facilities on the base at all times. It's the highest level of alert that the Navy has or had at that time for dealing with generally dealing with global nuclear threats. When you set a condition zebra, whether it's a drill or not, people who are not authorized to be there who do not have a zebra access badge, it's a zebra stripe badge on your clearance badge, they have to leave the command facility, and we have Marines stationed outside the building there, in the building and as well as outside, that were under orders to shoot any unauthorized personnel that remained in the command center. They would announce it beforehand, this is a drill, set condition zebra. And unauthorized personnel would be escorted out of the command center if they didn't already know that they had to leave. But they turned the lights down this time, and they didn't say this is a drill. There's a door right here, and this guy, the Marine, comes in and wants to know what's going on. Is this a drill or so forth? They've got orders to start shooting people. And I know because I actually got the junior OOD's attention and said, hey, you guys need to tell this guy something. He's ready to start shooting people, because they haven't told him to stand down yet, and which he did. And I remember, wanting to just get the hell out of there. We had contact with an unidentified flying object that had entered our airspace. And at that point, when Admiral Train found out that it wasn't the Soviets, and that he wanted to know were the Soviets responding to this threat also, that was the moment that he gave authorization to put 2 planes up to go see what this thing was. Pilots, you could hear the pilots' live voice transmissions being piped into the command center, visual confirmation on the object, description of the objects. Pilots were able to close a couple of times and be able to see that the object was not an aircraft that we were familiar with, was nothing that we had, was nothing the Soviets had, and that was determined very quickly. This thing absolutely had complete control of the situation and could just be wherever it wanted to be just in a matter of seconds. One minute we're closing on it off the coast of Maine. The next minute it's in Norfolk, headed south towards Florida. As Admiral Train was doing, he was scrambling, authorizing planes up just left and right. up and down the whole eastern seaboard. It headed out towards, over the Atlantic, towards the Azores. I do remember them saying that it had pulled up at a 66-degree angle when it approached, as it approached the Azores, like this, and it just pulled up at a 66-degree angle without slowing down or anything, and left the atmosphere, just was gone. It just took off into space and was gone, and just like that. The only descriptions that I recall that the pilots actually made were that they could not find any markings on the aircraft. They could not find any visible signs that the thing had wings, a tail, windows, a cockpit, or anything like that, or any markings from any country. They did get close enough to get some photographs taken that were later brought over to the command center. Well, from the photograph, I could remember the shape. What I would have said would have been, I would say a cylinder. I would say a cylinder because it was abrupt. It had abrupt ends. They didn't the ends didn't taper down like most aircraft.
This day, that particular day, I walked into the photo lab in the restricted area, and this was between missions. One of the gentlemen I had been friends with, and I still talk to occasionally, he pointed my attention to one area of this mosaic. It was one panel of a mosaic, and I said, "This is really interesting." He explained everything, and then he, with a smile on his face, he said, "Look over there." And I looked, and in one of the photo panels, I saw a round white dot. And at the time, it was very crisp, very sharp lines on it. And I said to him, what is that? Is that a dot on the emulsion? And then he's grinning, and he says, dots on the emulsion don't leave round shadows on the ground. And there was a round shadow at the right angle, at the correct angle, the sun shining on the trees. I saw pine trees. I didn't see a coastline. I don't know where this was. But I looked at him, and I was pretty startled because I'd worked out there several years and never seen anything like this, never heard of anything like this. And I said, "Is this a UFO?" And he's smiling at me, and he says, "I can't tell you that. I can't tell you that." What I knew he meant was it was, but he couldn't tell me. So I said, "What are you going to do with this information?" And he said, "Well, we always have to airbrush them out before we sell them to the public." And I was just amazed that they had a protocol in place for getting rid of UFO pictures. I asked guards, security guards. I ran into another security guard that was forced to burn a lot of UFO pictures. And he told me, he came into my office one day. This was when I worked at another job. He came into my office, and he was very frightened. And he said, "Donna, I heard you were interested in this subject." He said, "I used to work out there. And one day, some soldiers came in the fatigues and had me burn pictures." And he said that he was burning them, and he was forced not to look at them. But he was tempted. He looked at one of them, and it was a UFO on the ground. Shortly thereafter, he was hit in the head with a gun butt, and he still had a scar on his forehead from that, being knocked out, because he looked at the picture.
And we get quite a bit of information about the sightings. We get drawings of what the vehicles look like, whether they landed or not, whether they saw any people with them, extraterrestrials, things like that. And we would get pictures in of the supposedly AVM or satellite areas. And once in a while, an anomaly would show up on the picture that didn't belong there. A round object, a triangular object. They were not markings put on the photograph that indicate some place or anything like that. These were above ground. They were not part of the picture.
My boss came to me. I was working in a color lab at that time. I was a technician, photographic technician. I was asked to go over to this facility on Langley Air Force Base where the NSA was bringing in the information from the lunar orbiter. And so I packed up some tools, I went over, I went into the facility. A couple of officers took me into this hangar. It was a very large hangar. So they took me into this laboratory. I took a look at the equipment. There was an airman second class in there. I was an airman second class as well. He turned the equipment on and put it through its paces. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. I saw what was going on with it. And I said to him, you know, we'll have to take this thing out of the lab if we're going to work on it. We can't work on it in here in the darkroom environment. So everyone left the facility, left the darkroom, except this airman second class and myself. And we're in waiting for someone to come to remove this piece of equipment. And at the time, I didn't know what the real purpose of this darkroom and this operation in this facility was. I thought this was where they were bringing the data in and then releasing the images to the public. They were doing 35 millimeter strips of film at that time, which were then assembled into 18.5 by 11 inch mosaics, they were called. There was a digital signature and a grayscale on every 35 millimeter strip. And those strips were from successive passes around the moon. So he was showing me how all of this worked, and we walked over to one side of the lab, and he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And I said, whose? What do you mean, whose? He said, yes, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And at that point, I became frightened, and I was a little terrified, thinking to myself that if anybody walks in the room now, I know we're in jeopardy, we're in trouble, because he shouldn't be giving me this information. And then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings, there were very tall towers, and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. If I compare it to what I'm seeing now, because I do have photographs that have artifacts in them that are similar to what I saw, they're massive. Some of the structures are, you know, half a mile in size. So they're huge structures. Some of the buildings seem to have very reflective surfaces on them. A couple of structures that I saw reminded me of cooling towers at power generating plants. They had that sort of a shape. Some of them were just very, very straight and tall with a flat top. Some of them were round. Some of them looked like a Quonset hut, you know, with a domed kind of, like a greenhouse. The particular shot that I saw, there were several clustered together over a landscape, a fairly large landscape. I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy. Do you understand what I'm saying? I would love to have looked at it longer. I would have loved to have had copies. I would love to have, you know, said more about it or discussed it more, but I knew I couldn't, and I knew that young fellow who was sharing this was really, really overstepping his bounds at that point.
They said, we were going to show you a film that might help you best put into perspective what you gentlemen have witnessed and help you maybe put it to bed a little bit for yourselves. This thing went all the way up to the space program. It showed, and I swear to God, it showed structures on the moon, these box kind of things that looked sand-colored. It showed that lunar car moving around. I remember those clearly because I remember being a child when all that was happening, but them at a distance pointing, astronauts pointing at these box-looking things, structured objects moving off the surface of the moon, filmed by definite Apollo missions.
I was at a facility in California, that's all I can say, and I was doing particular classified work, set aside from what was actually happening there. It was a completely different scenario. The only thing I can say is it was occurring at the same time that our astronauts were doing a loop around the moon and back again. On their trip to that moon, or to the moon itself, I heard the expression of the bogey coming in at 11 o'clock. Well, familiar with that particular term, I perked my ears and started listening a little bit and discovered that Houston and the astronauts were talking back and forth about a collision. And the astronauts asked for permission to do avoidance for a collision, and Houston finally granted that permission to do that. And after the comm links settled down a little bit, the astronauts said it's not necessary. They are now paralleling our course, and there was a discussion as to what was paralleling that course. There was another type of ship. There were portals there that they could see in. They could see beings of some sort. They did not describe these beings. They just took photographs. And after a while, a few thousand miles, and then they took off from the capsule that they were flying in and went away.
Now, during this next section of the videotape, you will hear from people who have been involved in events where objects of extraterrestrial origin have landed or have crashed or been forced down and which have been retrieved. This is, of course, explosive testimony. It establishes the reality of the phenomenon and also of the fact that we have been studying this phenomenon for years. Many people will think that this is limited to the so-called Roswell event of the 1940s. This could not be further from the truth. In fact, there have been multiple events, at least a couple of dozen events, where objects of extraterrestrial origin have been acquired, have been retrieved, and which have been studied. We think that this is something which is of extreme importance because you cannot consider that covert programs, having spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the decades on research and development, so-called reverse engineering or back engineering of extraterrestrial technologies, have not had significant breakthroughs. The testimony will show that in fact we have had breakthroughs which have trickled out to our society in the form of certain advances in electronics. However, the central breakthrough dealing with the physics of the quantum vacuum space, the so-called zero-point energy phenomenon, as well as the anti-gravity electrogravitic phenomenon, that these technologies have been withheld from our society.
Back in 1962, I was lieutenant at Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany. Excuse me. I was a crypto officer for the entire Ramstein Air Base. I was a top secret control officer. And in that capacity, I happened to see a classified message go through my comm center which said that a UFO has crashed on the island of Spitsbergen, Norway, and a team of scientists are coming to investigate it. I do not recall where the message came from, where it was going to, because in that capacity, we were oftentimes told, what you see here, leave here. But I can recall seeing that.
We were in the basement of the Pentagon, and in those days, that was in 1959, there was a tremendous amount of security there in the basement of the Pentagon. Anybody who's worked there knows what I'm talking about. I learned a lot about Project Blue Book. Blue Book was discussed quite openly in the office. Sections of Blue Book were open for discussion. And then there were other matters as well that were brought to our attention one afternoon when we were just about ready to finish up training. It was about 3:30, maybe 3:45 in the afternoon. Colonel Hollibird brought out a piece of what appeared to be metallic. It was a metallic piece of, looked like a yardstick. It had deciphering. It had encryption on it. He did describe them as being symbols of instruction, and that's as far as he would go. But he did infer that the instructions, whatever they might have been, were something that was important enough for the military to to keep working on a constant basis. It seemed giant-like when I saw it because it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this before, and all eyes were just peeled on that particular thing. And when he told us what it was, it was frightening. It was eerie. There, you could have heard a pin drop in the room when it was first mentioned. Well, he said it had been taken from one of the craft that had crashed in New Mexico, and that it had been taken from a box of materials that the military was working on. They didn't use the word reverse engineering at that time, but it was something similar to the reverse engineering that they felt like they needed to work on, and it was going to take years to do this. Extraterrestrial bodies, yes. There were either 3 or 5, and they didn't even know at that point, because some of the information that they had gotten apparently was incomplete. But 3 or 5 stands out in my mind as the number that were taken. One was alive, partially alive at the time that this happened, and I do not know what may have happened to him after that. The findings that were put in there were highly scientific, and they were highly gone over by the people that knew what they wanted to put in there. This information was information that would never get out to to anyone else, but it was designed for the use of particular military personnel. There were probably 1,500 reported cases at that time. I would say there probably were between 200 and 300 cases of lock-on. And that's why those cases were in there, because they were authentic. You saw an awful lot. You saw a lot of pictures. Most of the pictures we have seen duplicates of today. Some were, the pictures that I saw were, I think, maybe a little bit better. They were taken by Air Force pilots, as well
pictures
of the UFOs. Yes.
So they actually had pictures of UFOs in these.
Oh, indeed they did. Yes, not only the Air Force, but some were taken by civilian pilots. Some were taken by Marine Air Corps pilots, and some were foreign. The whole process of dealing with the UFO phenomenon could not be handled anymore by one agency, and so in order to keep it alive, and I guess as cheaply as possible, it was given to various and sundry parts of the government to work on, and I guess they thought that they could also keep the intelligence factor as secret as possible by giving little agencies a little bit here and a little bit there, and that oftentimes is done with matters like this. But what happened was Eisenhower got sold out. I think that he realized that all of a sudden this matter is going into the control of corporations. He realized that he was losing control. He realized that the phenomenon of whatever it was that we were faced with was not going to be in the best hands, and those were as far as I can remember, that was the expression that was used. It's not going to be in the best hands, and so it has turned out to be.
One day, Sergeant Allen and the other sergeant, and I'll remember his name soon, Sergeant Atkins. They were, and Sergeant Montalegre, and they came to us and said, "Look, we got a situation where we have an aircraft crash that's possibly friendly, and they need us to go and secure the crash site. And well, we found the area really easy because there was a huge gash in the land where something had crashed. Everything was burned, and it was like if you had almost cut like a warm butter with a knife. I mean, it was just, it's like something on fire or had or some kind of energy, like a laser almost had like gutted. I mean, it was really strange, and basically we were the first ones to see the object. And basically what happened is we didn't go straight up the hill, because basically this thing went up the hill and then off into the side of the ravine or the ridge. This is about a 200-foot ridge at least. It was buried in the side of a cliff. But anyway, we didn't go straight up. We went on to the left and walked up to the top of the ridge. And that's when we saw the craft. Basically, this is a huge ship, and 10 meters in width and about 20 meters in length. I'm just not sure. That's just an estimate from what I remember. But it was huge. I mean, it was big, man. And it was shaped like almost like between an egg and like a teardrop almost. And when I first saw it, I was scared. It scared the heck out of me. I didn't know what to do, and it was dripping this syrup-like syrup viscosity, this liquid. It was everywhere, all down everywhere when we went down there, because there was plants and everything. And it was weird. It was a purplish green color, and it kind of like fluctuated. Like you couldn't really, when you'd look at it one time, then you'd look at it again, and it would it's almost like it. I don't know if it was like alive and it was just changing, but every time you looked at it, you saw a different shade of greenish purple. It was strange. There was one light on it that slowly went around, and the machine, I could hear it. I could hear, I guess because it was still functioning, and it had like a hum to it, like a really bass, like say if you unplugged an amp from a guitar, that kind of it was really it was really deep. And it kind of fluctuated, and then finally it just cut off, and everything just seemed to stop. When I was looking at the craft, it was buried, so I could see the back of it, and there were these large vents. Well, they look like vents, sort of like a fish gill on the back. I couldn't see around the other side, and I guess I'm assuming it was the same way on the other side. That looked like, I don't know, that could have been used for propulsion. I'm not sure. In Stinger School, they teach you about all different kinds of aircraft and stuff like that. And I knew a lot of aircraft anyway, because I like reading about aircraft and data and that stuff. And well, essentially, when I saw it, I'm like, man, this is nothing that I know of. When I saw the aircraft, it had been hit by something that had took it out. This is what I think happened: is we shot it down. The Peruvians shot it down. The other guys knew it was flying. I knew that these aircraft were flying because I had been in the command center there at the radar installation, and I heard a couple women there in the Air Force talking about aircraft flying in and out of the atmosphere at Mach 10 plus.
And that was happening.
Oh, this is happening all the time. There was like 3 or 4 incidents where I was duty there that the same Air Force officer came in there to get books. The reason, I guess the reason they were taking them is they didn't want people to know that they're tracking these aircraft. I guess, I mean, again, I'm just assuming that.
And this particular morning, when I went into the command post, I was met by the head of the command post, and he said that it's been a very exciting evening, that we've had UFOs in the, over the McGuire all night, and that one had apparently landed or possibly crashed at Fort Dix, and that when a military policeman came upon the alien, that he had pulled out a gun and shot them. And I said, a foreigner, an alien? I was a little bit confused by him saying alien. He says, no, an alien from outer space. He was very specific about the fact that an alien from outer space had been shot at Fort Dix, and that it had run away after being wounded and headed for McGuire. Now, McGuire and Fort Dix just have a fence between them. And this alien supposedly climbed the fence or went under it or whatever and got to McGuire and died out on the end of the runway. And that the security police were out there and had captured the body, so to speak, and were guarding it. And he said that a C-141 from Wright-Patterson was coming in to pick up the plane. So I was like, you know, my gosh, what's going on here? And he says, we want you to brief this at the, you know, stand-up general briefing this morning and explain what happened to everybody. And I was like, you want me to tell General Tom Sadler and everybody in the command post that, you know, we captured an alien? Almost every day I went to the photo lab because in your briefings you have, well, 4 screens and you have to keep them all, you know, filled up with pretty pictures and so on. And there they indicated that they had taken pictures of something extraordinary. And I said, well, let me see them. And the sergeant was handing it to me, and his master sergeant says he can't see those. So all I know is that they had some pictures that I wasn't allowed to see. But normally, being the general's briefer, I had never been, you know, stopped from seeing any pictures that they had previously. Now, one interesting thing is many of the key personnel on the base at that time who had a connection to this, with this, were quickly transferred from the wing commander on down.
They had a big black curtain that divided the hangar into two different areas, and that behind these curtains was another big area, and inside this area they had you know, all the lights turned off, and they go in, they turn the lights on, and here are 3 flying saucers floating off the floor. No cables suspended from the ceiling holding them up, no landing gear underneath, just floating, hovering above the floor. And they had little exhibits. They had a TV, a little videotape running showing the smallest of the 3 vehicles sitting out in the desert, presumably over a dry lake bed at someplace like Area 51. And it showed this vehicle making 3 little quick hopping motions like that, and then accelerating straight up and out of sight until you couldn't see it, and completely disappearing from view in just a couple of seconds. I mean, just boom, no sound, no sonic boom, nothing. They had a cutaway illustration, pretty much like the one I'll show you in a little bit, that showed what the internal components of this vehicle were, and they had some of the panels taken off so you could actually look in and see oxygen tanks and a little robotic arm that could extend out from the side of the vehicle for collecting samples and things. So obviously, this is a vehicle that not only is capable of flying around through the atmosphere, but it's also capable of going out to space and collecting samples. And it's using a type of propulsion system that doesn't make any noise. As far as he could see, it had no moving parts, and didn't have any exhaust gases or fuel to be expended. It was just there, hovering. Well, the synthetic vision system that's on the AR, what they called the Alien Reproduction Vehicle, it was also nicknamed the Flux Liner. This anti-gravity propulsion system, this flying saucer, one of 3 that were in this hangar at Norton Air Force Base. This synthetic vision system uses the same kind of technology as the gun slaving system that they have in the Apache helicopter, except in this case you have 2 cameras, and it picks any pair of the cameras in that pattern of 6 that are around the circumference, including the one on the top. Whichever pair most closely matches the orientation of the pilot's head. This shows the cutaway. You can see the 4 ejection seats. Actually, there are 2 facing us, but there are also 2 that are sort of facing away from us on the other side of that central column. You can see the oxygen tanks down here in the corner that actually go all the way around the inside of the skirt. There's also another set of oxygen tanks that are inside the crew compartment sphere. Brad said a couple things about this system. Now, I should also describe, he said there were 3 vehicles. The first one, the smallest one, the one was partially taken apart, the one that was shown in the video that was running in this hangar, November 12, 1988 at Norton Air Force Base, was about 24 feet in diameter at its widest part, right at the base of that flange. The next biggest one was 60 feet in diameter at the base. Oh, by the way, and the largest of 3 vehicles was about 120 to 130 feet in diameter. I mean, that's massive when you think about it. It's just huge. Brad said that in this exhibit at Norton Air Force Base that a 3-star general said that these vehicles were capable of doing light speed or better.
MacArthur organized what was called the Interplanetary Phenomena Research Unit. It would later be taken over by General Marshall, and it continued all the way through to present day. Names have been changed. Records still haven't surfaced. The Army tries to state that it was not an official organization effort to try to investigate UFOs, but it was organized by a general. It bore fruit. It came to conclusions it was not popular, i.e. interplanetary spacecraft. And they continued to do exactly what they do today, and that is to be part of a multi-intelligent operation in the recovery of objects of unknown origin, particularly those that are of non-earthly origin, and to assess that information, get raw field intelligence data, and process that data into some type of useful intelligence product to disseminate to the field to those people who have a need to know, and those people that are the, shall we say, the keepers of that information. In the 1950s, the United States Air Force had an elite unit to investigate UFOs outside of Blue Book, even though Blue Book thought that that unit was working with them, that they were not. This unit was initially organized as the 4602nd Air Intelligence Service Squadron. Among its peacetime missions was Operation Blue Fly. Operation Blue Fly was to recover objects of unknown origin that fell to Earth. It's very important that you remember objects that fell to Earth because we didn't have any spacecraft up there at this time. Later it would be expanded in 1957 to cover all objects of unknown all objects of unknown origin, and it would become part of what they would call in the 1957 October time frame Project Moondust. In short, under Moondust, under Blue Fly, we have recovered alien debris, not of this Earth. You have an airplane accident. We have standard procedures on how we handle that. Those same procedures are utilized when you do a recovery or extraction of a crashed spacecraft or debris thereof. And I have to stress debris simply because these are highly advanced technical machines. There were not that many crashes. They're flawable because they are made by an intelligence that is as mortal as you and I. Us being mortal, we are subject to error. Now, the way you package the material, if it's just debris, is handled the same way you would if it was hazardous material. You took precautions. If you had a whole craft, you took very serious precautions, because while I still state they are not hostile, but you could cause some serious accidents which would result in death. We were informed that there had only been a couple dozen, tops, that there were several in the 40s, in the early 50s. And once again, to make it perfectly clear about those events that took place there, I mean, it sounds crazy, but their guidance system, our radar wreaked havoc on, and they had to make adjustments to their guidance systems for that.
What happened was we found out that high power radar would interfere with their stability, because we could watch the amplifiers and stabilizers come down when it was low and slow, and radar affected them when it was low and slow.
we tracked it. We were tracking it at the time, and we were successful in damming it enough where it crashed. And yes, there were some aliens on it. Yes, we got them.
How many bodies had been recovered? Don't know. How many crashes have occurred in which we only got debris from because they came and did their recovery before we got there? Don't know, but it has happened. It has happened. When they have problems, just like we send out a distress call, they send out a distress call, which is something that a lot of people don't allude to or don't even... It's the one question that's never asked. But here again, we think of them as something intangible, like that stuffed animal there. But they're living, breathing creatures, as mortal as you and I. They think, they have loves, they have likes, they have dislikes, they have social culture. This is so important to try to make people understand that that is the case.
This section of the briefing is regarding secrecy. How secrecy works. How have these projects worked? Some years ago, a military advisor of mine explained to me something called an Unacknowledged Special Access Project, or USAP. This is a project which, while compartmented and which requires special access, is also unacknowledged. And what that means is that no one outside of that compartmented area of operation is told about it. And it doesn't matter if the person is the President of the United States, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I have, over the past 8 years, had the responsibility, unwelcome, I might add, on my part, of having to brief a sitting CIA director on this issue, a sitting head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, an admiral who headed up the J2 position, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as other senior people within the Congress, the Senate, the United Nations, and foreign governments. I have found that for the most part, these high officials have known nothing about these compartmented special access projects which are unacknowledged and which deal with this issue.
Depending on the level of the compartmentalization and the secrecy level, you have to go through a fairly significant background check. It takes between 6 months to a year to get the background checks. And then when you do that, then you generally, if you're in a very tight compartment, then you have to sign a statement that you will not divulge the existence of the project or even answer a question that could divulge the existence of the project. And it's not even on a need-to-know basis. It's on a basis of people being identified specifically to know what you're working on and directly associated with the project. If you have a covert project, the funding would come through a number of government sources, none of which would be identified to the workers. It's just that you sign a contract with the U.S. government and the funding would show up at the right place at the right time. There's a large number of covert projects that go on in the United States that none of us are ever aware of. I mean, I know people today that worked on one of the things that I worked on, that if you asked them, do you recognize this name, they would, even if I can show it to you on the internet, there's some things that have come up recently on the internet where some of the stuff that I was associated with, their names are now on the internet. They would say, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. In their 70s now. But they still absolutely would never admit that they even know what you're talking about. So you don't know. You have no idea.
Somewhere along the line, they may see that material and realize there's some very highly sensitive information that would have damning effect upon the national security of the United States should it become compromised. It requires to be further protected, to ensure that there is only a limited access to that information to a small number of people. So small you can put them on a list of paper or on a piece of paper and list them by name. Thus you have the special access programs. The controls that were supposed to be put on the special access programs are not there. When it comes to UFOs, the same criteria applies. The problem we have right now is that that event, i.e. the ultimate contact, where there is no longer a question about the reality of other beings in the universe coming here, that event has not taken place. Therefore, but a small nucleus within the intelligence community, numbering less than 100, and I'd suggest less than 50, control all that information. It is not subject to congressional review by the Information Security Oversight at all. We have got to get the documentation as it exists in the government files. We have got to get it released before it ultimately comes up being destroyed. During the discussion of UFOs, the question ultimately is going to come up, can any government keep secrets, let alone the U.S. government? And the answer to that is unequivocally yes. But one of the greatest weapons the intelligence community has at their disposal is a predisposition by the American people, the American politicians, and I hate to call them debunkers, but we'll call them debunkers, people who wish to try to debunk UFO information. They immediately come out, oh, we can't keep secrets, we can't keep secrets. Well, the whole situation is, yes, we can. I am prepared to state that I have been at locations where craft of unknown origin that did not originate on the face of this planet was there. I am prepared to state that while I was there, we saw living, dead bodies of entities that were not born on this planet. I am prepared to state that we had what they referred to as interfacing with those entities. I am prepared to state that the situation is they have a school to try to indoctrinate people. I never went to that school. I always refused. We have contact with aliens not originating from some foreign country, but from some other solar system. And I have been a party to that.
A government is widespread, as everybody knows. I mean, it's into everybody's pockets and everybody's life all over the place, and the same thing holds true for the UFO extraterrestrial, if you want to look at it that way. But very, very few people really know the full knowledge of what's going on. It's held very tightly within black covert operations. They keep pretty much each organization an island unto itself. You don't have cross-departmentalization a lot within the programs. TRW, Johnson Controls, Honeywell, all of them at some point or another became involved with the intelligence field. Certain works, some of Phil Corso's early back engineering projects. If you will look into those, Atlantic Research was one of them, way back. Entities that were created out of people in the Pentagon to become a quote-unquote Beltway bandit. Received projects, grants, and monies to do certain projects that were so highly classified, even though there was only a top secret, but so compartmentalized that only about 4 people would know what was going on. But as far as UFO and intelligence and extraterrestrial goes, it's right at the top. And I would say that the president has such limited knowledge of it. I know Carter did not have any knowledge whatsoever. And I worked right there with the organization, President Carter's organization.
This is in January 21st. Actually, the meeting, I guess, took place on January 22nd of 1977. And President Carter, after his inauguration the previous day, called the Director of Central Intelligence in and informed him that the President wanted to have access to the classified documents relating to unidentified flying objects and the potential existence of extraterrestrial intelligence. At that time, the Director of Central Intelligence, George Bush Sr., informed the President that Mr. Bush was not going to release this information to the President.
In fact, Jimmy Carter was not brought into the loop. They, for some reason, the group, the control group, they don't trust the guy for some reason. They don't trust Jimmy Carter. They were afraid that he would come out and make statements, blanketed statements to the news media.
And the truth is, they have hidden things like UFO and extraterrestrial information from us for years. Not just the current era, but back before the 1900s.
There's about 38 levels above top secret. The highest is cosmic. That's, okay, I'll tell you right off now, that's UFOs, aliens, and particleization. Now, like you heard a while ago, there's only probably about 25 people in the world that know things that are known at that level. No president has had that level, has ever been cleared for that level. Eisenhower was the closest. One that did not exist, it was so secret, was the NRO. You couldn't mention NRO, the National Reconnaissance Organization.
NRO, National Reconnaissance Office. Basically run by the Air Force. The Reconnaissance Office, from my understanding of people that I've had contacts with since I retired, has taken on a lot more responsibility, particularly towards UFO and extraterrestrial activities. Almost you could say that they picked up where Blue Book dropped off.
Eisenhower wanted somebody to be in charge. He tried the CIA director, and it didn't work. CIA was working primarily for itself. Most of the intelligence directors of the services were working for themselves. So he said, I want it to be independent. I want it to be civilian. I want it to be some of our top scientists. And so it was organized under the name, the NRO. If you're on that level, there's an organization worldwide called ACIO. That's Alien Contact Intelligence Organization. If you pay your dues and you follow the rules, you can benefit, your government is allowed to benefit from that organization's information.
When I was a corporate manager of Fairchild Industries in 1974 through 77, I met the late Dr. Werner von Braun in early 74. At that time, von Braun was dying of cancer, but he assured me that he would live a few more years in order to tell me about the game that was being played, that game being the effort to weaponize space, to control the Earth from space and space itself. Von Braun's purpose in life during the last years of his life, his dying years, was to educate the public and decision makers about why space-based weapons are a dumb, dangerous, destabilizing, too costly, unnecessary, unworkable, undesirable idea. The strategy that Werner von Braun taught me was that first the Russians are going to be considered to be the enemy. In fact, when I met him in 74, they were the enemy, the identified enemy. We were told that they had killer satellites. We were told that they were coming to get us and control us, the dirty commies, that whole story. First, the Russians were the enemy against whom we're going to build space-based weapons. Then terrorists would be identified, and that was soon to follow. We heard a lot about terrorism. Then we were going to identify third world country crazies. We now call them nations of concern. But he said that would be the third enemy against whom we would be needing to build space-based weapons. And the next enemy was asteroids. Now at this point, he kind of chuckled the first time he said it. Asteroids, against asteroids we're going to build space-based weapons. So it was funny then. And the funniest one of all was against what he called aliens, extraterrestrials. That would be the final card. And over and over and over, during the 4 years that I knew him and was giving his speeches for him, he would bring up that last card. And remember, Carol, the last card is the alien card. We're going to have to build space-based weapons against aliens, and all of it, he said, is a lie. He didn't mention a timeline, but he said that it was going to be speeding up faster than anybody could possibly imagine, that the effort to put weapons in space was not only based on a lie, but would accelerate past the point of people even understanding it until it was already up there and too late. In 1977, I was at a meeting in Fairchild Industries in a conference room called the War Room. This is 1977, and they were talking about creating a war in the Gulf region when there was $25 billion in the space-based weapons program that yet had not been identified. It wasn't called the Strategic Defense Initiative, at least, until 1983. This weapons system then had obviously been going on for some time that I didn't know anything about. So I stood up in this meeting in 1977 and it said, I'd like to know why we're talking about space-based weapons against these enemies. I'd like to know more about this. Would somebody tell me what this is about? Nobody answered. They went on with this meeting as though I hadn't said anything.
The ballistic missile defense system is probably a pipe dream in the sense that if what it's designed for is that you know where it's coming from. And when we had Russia, there was a 50-50 chance that you knew about where it would be coming from. With the rogue nations we have today, it's absolutely ludicrous. In the 50s, they built a nuclear warhead that fit inside a Sparrow, AIM-7 Sparrow, which has an 8-inch diameter body. And that was a quarter-kiloton weapon. That'll fit inside any briefcase you can think of. Now, the guy may die carrying it, but he's going to die anyway, so what difference does it make? I'm far more feared of that.
Weapons in space is still a big enigma. Black covert operations have always been trying to do something like that. When Star Wars was brought out as an idea, which was before Reagan actually, and incorporated into his administration, it became pretty much a window dressing, as one people would call it, but there was a lot of truth behind what they were trying to do. They knew the basic principle of what they wanted to do. They wanted a weapon system they could put in space that would stop a ballistic missile. That was the concept. Now, if that ballistic missile happened to be coming from another direction other than earthbound, could it do the same thing? Or was it a ballistic missile? You know, concepts were there. Ideas were there.
I have concluded that I'm fighting against the clock, that I have but a short time to try to convince people that we are moving in an avenue where we are going to militarize space. As a result of militarizing space, we are going to acquire new technology. We're going to evolve new technology that's going to lead us into interstellar travel. As a direct result, we will become a threat to them unless we spiritually grow also.
I noticed the satellite's positionings. I said, now this is supposed to be a system that tracks radar anomalies on Earth, right? You know, the whole thing, the movement. Yep, that's what it does. And I said, so why are half of them pointed towards the outer space? Towards the moon, towards areas that are just blank space? Well, I don't know, was the reply. He says, never thought about it. I says, well, at least half of those satellites you got up there aren't looking at Earth. I said, what are they looking for? He says, well, you got to have need to know about that. I said, I see. In other words, who's coming? He says, we don't know. Dropped, end of subject. There was a fear then that of something out there. It became a very big concern. asteroids, UFOs, people coming from other places. Paranoia was also there within the government. You know, at certain levels, you could feel it. You knew it was happening. Would they tell the truth about it? I doubt it.
So when I hear that there's a possible threat of extraterrestrials, and I look at the history of thousands of years of possible visitations, recorded history, and when I hear now the stories of the disclosures of honest military intelligence industry people who have had experiences with UFOs, with crashes and landings, with live or dead bodies of extraterrestrial beings, people from out in the universes. And if I'm ever told that these are enemies against whom we have to build space-based weapon systems, based on my own personal experience of having worked in the military-industrial complex on weapon systems and military strategy, I'm going to know it's a lie.
Now, some would like for us to believe and like to develop the idea that the aliens and people are our enemy now, but that's not true. There's no proof that I have ever read in any official document.
We ascertain, like, oh, are these people safe? Are these people that have come in out from outside, are they hostile? Well, if they were hostile, my own knowledge is, and feeling, I don't know about all of them, is that we could have been, with their weaponry as it might be used, it could have destroyed us a long time ago.
If beings can travel in time-space, then anything we would put in orbit as a weapon would be like going against Genghis Khan with a firecracker.
I have concluded that it's based on a few people making a lot of money and gaining power. It's about ego. It's not about our essence and who we really are on the planet and loving each other and being at peace and cooperating, using technologies to solve problems and heal people in the planet. It isn't about that. It's about a few people who really are playing an old, dangerous, costly game for their own pocketbooks and power struggle. That's all it is. And I believe that this entire space-based weapons game is initiated right here in the United States of America. And what I hope is that with the new administration, I hope that this information that's being disclosed will allow the new administration to do what is right, which is to transform the war game into a space game, so that we use the technologies that are available, not just as spin-offs of war technology, but as direct technological applications to building a cooperative space system that will benefit the entire world.
We know that these unacknowledged special access projects have used intimidation, have used threats, and at times people have been killed to maintain this secrecy. I know that this is an extreme statement to make, but I am convinced from talking to not one but dozens of military and intelligence men and women that this type of intimidation and threatening behavior has happened and continues to happen. I think this is something which is unacceptable in a democracy and in our society.
He told us we could not talk about this to anyone, including any of the other crews, our spouses, our family, even amongst each other. So we could not discuss this at all.
It had been discussed with me on numerous occasions. Talked about what could happen to me militarily and what could happen to me even if I discussed this as a civilian.
Anything to discredit you, and you'd never get a promotion, and I'd spend the next 3.5 years up at the North Pole living in a tent checking the weather balloons.
I've made no money from this. I've got nothing but pain and suffering out of talking about it. I've been harassed at my home. This was used against me partially in losing a job once in teaching. I've had a hell of a time after I've told this story, but I continue to tell the story because I think it's important for people to understand that this sort of shit goes on in the government.
if their military personnel were to talk about this, they could be court-martialed, or at least threatened to be court-martialed, to get them to back down and to scare them. And other intimidations would be to hold their paychecks back, transfer them to other bases where a lot of people would not want to go to, like Alaska.
These two gentlemen began to question me about this event. And I remember, you know, saying to them, they were being pretty rough, you know, about it, to be honest with you. And I remember telling them, literally putting my hands up and going, "Wait a minute, fellas, I'm on your side. You know, whoa, just a minute," because they were not really nice. They were very intimidating and made it quite clear to the point that nothing that was seen, heard, or witnessed that transpired during that was to leave this building. You not to say a word to it about your coworkers and off base. You just forget everything you may have seen or heard or whatever concerned with this. It didn't happen. My logbook, I never did see that again. I know we had a new logbook the next day, a brand spanking new one to start with, and that disappeared. They gave me this document where for 5 years it was absolutely out of the question. I could not leave the country under any circumstances whatsoever. And to leave the state of Virginia, I had to contact the Roanoke office of the FBI and let them know if I just wanted to cross the state line down here to go into North Carolina or just leave the state of Virginia. I had to let the FBI know about it. And that was for 5 years after I was discharged.
I was arrested. I had all my gear taken from me by men in black camis, had no name tags. They were older men, probably in their late 30s or 40s. There were other people, I guess they were government, I don't know. They were there and they had containment suits. And then they put me on a cot that they had, and they had me cuffed with those, they had me cuffed both hands down, and then they had my legs tied together with those plastic fasteners that the police use. And they had a lieutenant colonel from the Air Force, and he did not identify himself. He might have, I just don't remember. And he told me, if we just took you out in the jungle, they'd never find you out there. And I'm like, well, and I didn't want to say, I didn't want to test him to see if he'd really do that. So I said, yeah. And he's like, you got to sign these papers, and you never saw this, and I don't exist, and this situation never happened. And if you tell anybody, you'll just come up missing. And he was a real abrasive, just a cynical asshole, I guess is the best way to put it.
Measures have been taken by agencies to terminate people who appear to be inconvenient or troublesome through knowing too much.
I would go interview people that claimed they had seen something and try to convince them they hadn't seen something, or they were, hallucinating or something. Well, if that didn't work, another team would come in and give all the threats and threaten them, their family, and so on and so forth. And they would be in charge of discrediting them and make them look foolish or so on and so forth. Now, if that didn't work, then there was another team that put an end to that problem, one way or the other. Secretary of Defense Forstall was the first real powerful known person that was eliminated because he was going to release the information. And nobody has ever paid for that crime. That crime has never been really thoroughly investigated by forces to see what happened to him. But most people know that he was thrown out the window of the hospital, and he wasn't killed by being thrown out the window, but he never got up alive.
He was talking about being erased. And I said, man, what do you mean erased? He said, yes. He said, you will be erased. I said, how do you know all this? Or something to that effect. And he said, I know. He said they'll go after not only you. He said they'll go after your family. Now, those were his words.
And they're yelling at me, and they're hollering and cursing, and you didn't see anything, and we'll do you and your whole goddamn family. And they're it was basically that for about 8 or 9 hours. These guys, they're just off on their own. There's no oversight, no control, and they just do whatever they want. They don't, and they're evil, man. These people are evil.
In the military, they do ridicule you, because I was ridiculed a few times. I was told I would never make Master Sergeant. I was on orders for tech, but I was told I would never make Master Sergeant if I brought this crap up again.
The pilots that had seen things and talked about it, some of them were let go. Some of them released from their flying and treated as nutcases and things like that.
I don't know, it's sort of strange, but we send people to prison. We send people to their death because of eyewitness accounts of crimes. Our legal system is based on that to a large degree. Yet, in my following of unusual aerial phenomenon for the past 50 years, there seems to be some reason to discredit very viable and very reputable witnesses when they say something is unidentified.
Now, one of the things that I've found is that the way it's been kept secret to a big extent is the fact of through ridicule. If it always had been just top secret, I think most of the world would know about it. At times I used to carry nuclear weapons. And in other words, I was mentally fit to carry nuclear weapons, but I'm not mentally fit if I see a UFO. Well, this criticism and this ridicule has, I think, done more to keep the story coming out than almost anything else.
This now brings us to the very big issue of why. Why the secrecy? Why has this been kept away from the public all these years? Many witnesses feel that in the early days, in the 30s and 40s and perhaps 50s, that there was concern for how the average person would react to this information, that perhaps society was not prepared, either on a theological basis or on a social basis, an economic basis, for this information. I will not dispute that fact. I was a child in the 50s, just born in the mid-50s, and I do not know personally what the milieu was that could have affected how people would react. I will say that this is 2001 and not 1951. And in the last half century, that argument is no longer valid. The world has seen humans walk on the moon. My uncle was one of the designers of the lunar module that took Neil Armstrong to the moon. I don't believe anyone living today on this planet would be shocked to hear that there is life in the universe and that we have been visited. I do think that the reasons for secrecy evolved in the 50s up to this date, and they have much more to do with the economic order and the fact that the technologies related to these extraterrestrial vehicles, as well as human breakthroughs unrelated to these extraterrestrial vehicles, have given us energy and propulsion systems within the black budget, compartmented, unacknowledged world, which would have a significant beneficial effect for the world, but would have a deleterious short-term effect for certain special interests. I believe these special interests would include the conventional energy part of our economy, the internal combustion engines, the fossil fuel plants, gas, oil, coal, and ionizing nuclear technology related to nuclear power plants. We know that those technologies are already obsolete. I want to emphasize here that this is not a theory. We have testimony from people who have worked on these projects, within these projects, that can establish the fact that we have fully operational technologies which would enable the world to have no need for these polluting forms of energy.
The first question, and this is probably one of the major reasons why this topic has been kept quiet so long, the first question that one might ask, even the man or woman on the street is going to ask, well, if there are these peoples from other planets and they're here visiting us, how did they get here? Did they have to come at the speed of light and take 400 to hundreds of years to get here, even at the speed of light, or did they come with using some other technology? Then where do they get the energy to travel these great speeds? And then we start to look into the energy. They aren't using jet fuel, they aren't using coal to get here. They're using technologies that the average guy on the street, the average physicist in a university doesn't have any clue about, and yet it's very real.
In a few instances, I can say there are clearly over-unity electromagnetic devices, things that produce more electrical energy out than in. We are not in Kansas any longer.
0-point energy represents about 40 to 50 megawatts of power per cubic inch of space. That's a lot of power. That's 4,600 million watts of power. And if you could tap it at will, then no one would have to sell gasoline or oil anymore. You would just tap into it. It would be like taking and going out to the Great Lakes and taking out one drop and using it. You'd hardly miss it.
Yes, there is a history, a long history of over-unity systems. For example, Nikola Tesla had one. Basically, his big magnifying transformer that he had on Long Island was such an over-unity system. So this was one thing we established from the study of the foundations of electromagnetics. You are permitted to have electromagnetic systems that power themselves and their load, and you don't have to put in the energy. They take it from the vacuum, the active vacuum. The bottom line of this is if we'll initiate the negative entropy and let it go, it's just like you punched a hole in the ground and you got a big gusher of oil. You don't have to furnish the pressure and you don't have to furnish the oil. Here it comes.
Well, if you have one of these units, you know, that's about 16 inches long and about 8 inches high and about 10 inches wide, then you don't need to plug into Kit Carson, the local electric company. It burns nothing, no pollution, okay? It never wears out because there's no moving parts. What the people in power right now don't want us to know is that this free energy is available to everybody.
In conclusion, I would like to state that this is a matter of the utmost significance to the American people, but also to peoples throughout the world. We can establish now that we are not alone. It can be proven that there are technologies which could give us a new and sustainable civilization. And we are certain that the secrecy surrounding this issue constitutes a threat to the national security and to the security of the whole entire world.
This whole project of bringing this out in the open will probably take other people too. But myself, I'm 73 years old, and I've had a good life and no regrets, and I've loved this country, and I've been a Christian all my life since I was about 11 years old, and so I believe God wants this known. I believe the cosmos wants this known.
It still bothers me that I've seen all this, I know all this, and like I'm walking around like with the answer, and nobody wants to ask the question to get the answer, and it kind of irritates me a little bit.
It's about time for them to just come forward and say, hey, this is it.
It's a truth that the entire world has to be informed about, and that truth is man is not alone.